Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a webinar hosted by the AIIA China Matters Fellowship Program. My name is Michael Wesley, and I am Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Global Culture and Engagement at the University of Melbourne and a Board Director at China Matters. I begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live. That is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In December 2021, the Australian Institute of International Affairs and China Matters were delighted to announce the appointment of Ms. Yun Jiang as the inaugural AIIA China Matters Fellow. The AIIA is Australia's longest existing private research institute on politics and international relations. China Matters is an independent Australian policy institute established in 2014 to inform public and elite opinions and recommend solid Australian policy on the complexities of Australia's relationship with the PRC. The AIIA China Matters Fellowship is an investment in the next generation of Australian China specialists. The fellowship is funded entirely by donations from Australian citizens and from wholly Australian-owned and controlled companies or foundations. Prior to the fellowship, Ms. Jiang was co-founder and former editor of the newsletter China Neitan and a managing editor of the China Story blog. She's published and been cited widely on China-related topics with a focus on Australia's policies on the PRC. Today, Yun will discuss her latest research report, PRC's Approach to Indonesia, Competing for Regional Influence. Yun is joined here today by three experts in the field. Mr. Ben Bland, Director of the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House. Thank you for calling in from London, Ben. Dr. Gatra Priyandita, an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Centre in Canberra. Thank you for joining us, Gatra. And Dr. Evan A. Laksmana, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia Military Modernisation at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Asia. Evan, thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you all for being here today. So this evening's seminar will go as follows. I will ask Yun firstly to introduce the key research from her report. Then I will bring in our panelists and facilitate a discussion between all of our experts. There will be time at the end for audience Q&A. If you have a question for Yun or one of our panelists, please type it into the Q&A box in Zoom, and please do include your name and title, and we'll try and get through as many of those questions as we can by the time we finish in just under an hour. So without further ado, Yun, over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you also for being with me, my fellow panelists, and I can see a lot of familiar names in the name for people that are here today. So thank you all for coming. I'm speaking from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. The report on Indonesia, China was launched just yesterday. So I have briefly talked a little bit about some of the main findings from the report, and then hopefully we'll get a bit more in-depth from then on. So as a result of the intensifying geopolitical competition between China and the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, these two countries have ramped up efforts to court and/or coerce, some would say, other countries in the region. And my report's focus is on China's approach to Indonesia. Now, according to the latest Lowy Institute's Power Index, China is more influential than the US in Indonesia. Now, that's a very broad stroke, of course, but this is still quite notable because there comes despite there being a 2 decade of a break in the bilateral relationship between the two countries from 1960s. And the relationship was only restored officially in 1990. So their official diplomatic relationship is somewhat actually shorter than Australia's with China's. In recent years, especially for China, the souring of relations with the West has meant that to China, the countries outside Europe and outside the Anglosphere has become a bit more of a focus, a bit more important to its foreign policy as well as its foreign investment. And Indonesia, one of the biggest developing countries, and actually forecast to be world's 4th largest economy by 2050, is of course an important partner for China. So my report argues that when China pursues its interests with Indonesia, it generally tries to appeal to Indonesian government's domestic priorities. So thereby, it is mostly, you could argue, using more incentives rather than coercion. So more of a carrots over sticks. And that contrasts a little bit with the dominance of the narrative in Australia of this Chinese coercion, being China uses coercion as the most used tactic towards other countries. China has mitigated a lot of the potential tensions in relationships. So some of them we are familiar with include South China Sea, of course, and the treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Those issues have not caused perhaps as much bilateral political damage as one might expect. So for South China Sea, the two countries have sometimes appeared to have reached some sort of a tacit understanding where both governments, of course, will stand firm on the sovereignty and territorial issues, while at the time they do conduct some low-key negotiations. So, for example, Indonesia has sent a message of territorial integrity, while at the same time, some of the senior ministers in the government have downplayed sometimes a dispute with China, calling it an economic and not a sovereignty issue. And on Muslims in Xinjiang, Indonesia is a little bit hesitant to criticize China too much, and that's because of the domestic considerations. It is aligned with China in that it believes that human rights concerns are a domestic affairs. It does not, of course, does not want other countries to then support what it is doing in West Papua, for example, or highlight its human rights concerns there. And of course, China has also mitigated some of that by its active faith diplomacy as well. But despite all that, despite this mitigation of the tensions and what China is doing, actively trying to incentivize the Indonesian government, the public opinion. So we're going from the government opinion to public opinion has turned quite increasingly negative against China. And this is actually partly due to the trade investment links between the two countries. From China's perspective, Chinese government's perspective, economic cooperation, trade, investment, that's a main driver of its bilateral relationship. That's what makes China attractive to a lot of other countries, including Australia, being a ballast of the relationship. But for a lot of Indonesians, they do not think that China's economic growth has been good for Indonesia. And they're quite skeptical of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And they're skeptical of the Chinese investment in Indonesia because one most often cited reason is the use of migrant labor. This resentment towards Chinese migrant workers is conflated with the general distrust of Chinese Indonesians. According to a survey, more than 40% of Indonesians believe that Chinese Indonesians are loyal to China. And indeed, with recent events we saw in different elections, there has been disinformation circulating as part of a scare campaign that Indonesia was facing influx of Chinese workers. But for China, the state media in China has intentionally downplayed this anti-China and anti-Chinese sentiment, which I think is quite interesting. It contrasts with how it approaches the issue of racism, for example, in the United States and in Australia, where it does highlight those issues. But when it comes to Indonesia, it tries not to do that in the same way. I think this is because to the Chinese government, a stable bilateral relationship is much more important than the Chinese diaspora in Indonesia. I think I'll stop there. I've probably gone a bit too long. Well, looking forward to discussions.
Thank you, Yun. I very much commend the report to people attending the seminar. I think we'll now turn to each of our panelists to provide comment and ask them to keep their remarks to around 5 to 6 minutes each. Ben, I think we'll start with you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks Yun for a great report and for having me in this interesting seminar. Yeah, I'll be very brief. I'll just talk about kind of my perspective in terms of how Indonesia engages with China, which is kind of a bit of a mirror to what Yun's been talking about, and then maybe pick up on a few things in her report that I agree and disagree with slightly. So for me, I think Indonesia's approach to China is quite similar to other Southeast Asian nations, and I think of it through the 3 Ds, which are deference, distrust, and development. So very briefly, deference. I think we can see that Indonesia approaches China in a very careful way at an elite level. As Yun points out, the way that Indonesian senior officials and the President Jokowi himself talk about China is with a lot of respect. I think Indonesia, like other Southeast Asian nations at an elite level, is often reluctant to call out the Chinese government or Chinese companies for things that they would happily call out the US or Australia for. One good example is the kind of arms race that we're seeing across the region, and Indonesia's been quite vocal in different ways about its concerns about Australia's plans to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, but much less vocal about China's nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine building program. So yes, deference, the first one. But secondly, and this is obviously in a bit of tension with the deference, is distrust. So I don't think there's much elite trust or popular trust for China. In terms of popular trust, we know that because Evan and I and former colleague Natasha Kassam from Lowy did a poll in Indonesia a couple of years ago, and we could see that there's a really high level of distrust towards China as a country, and also Xi Jinping as a leader. And I think we can also see that, you know, in the elite relationships more generally, that it's very transactional. It's not based on a deep trust, although there is a sense that there are some shared elements of the worldview. But I think what we have to understand is that for Indonesia, there's very little trust with any of its partners, and I think the same for China. And often as Westerners and people in Western governments misunderstand these relationships because we like to build our kind of diplomatic relationships through trusted partners first. But for many developing countries, actually, there's no one they really trust. So there's a lot of distrust to go around. And the last 3, which I think is particularly important under President Jokowi, is development, by which I don't just mean sort of development assistance, but development much more generally encompassing trade and investment and infrastructure opportunities. And clearly, I think for the whole of Southeast Asia, but for Indonesia in particular, China is such an important development partner across all those spheres, which I think is also one of the reasons why Indonesia is very cautious in what it says and how it manages China, coming back to that deference question. So they're all linked issues, I would say. And then just a few kind of points of response to things in Yun's paper. I think, as she points out, you know, there are shared interests between China and Indonesia. And I think outsiders, particularly in the Western world, often kind of underestimate how much there are shared interests in development, in protecting sovereignty, in sort of shielding countries from human rights criticism in the wider world. That's one point. I think, as Yun hints to at various points, China's foreign policy is also getting smarter and more proactive towards Indonesia. I think in the outside world, we're often fooled by the wolf warrior diplomacy. And that's maybe how Chinese diplomats sort of react in the West. But I think there's something different that goes on when they're engaging in Indonesia. And we see good examples of that in how China's ambassador, Lu Kang, has been trying to promote China's work on the Saudi-Iran deal in Indonesia to Islamic groups and at universities and speeches. So there's something really interesting going on there. And then just lastly, I would disagree slightly with Yun's sort of characterization that it's all carrots and no sticks from China's perspective. I mean, I think while it's true there are a lot of development carrots, there's a lot of implied stick, right? And I think part of the reason Indonesia is quite hesitant in any kind of public criticism of China is because they fear the sort of economic coercion that Australia and others have been hit with in the past. And I think Indonesian officials understand that their economy is obviously much less diversified and developed than Australia's. So Indonesia's ability to withstand sort of economic pressures is far smaller than that of Australia. So I think there is a constraining element there, even if it's implied, even if China doesn't go around explicitly threatening. But to be honest, at times in the past when there have been issues over the Natuna Sea, I think there has been kind of coercion, to be honest, behind closed doors as well. So I would disagree slightly there, but I suspect Evan and Gatra will have much more to say about that. So I will pass the floor back to you, Michael, and then thanks.
Many thanks, Ben. Really interesting reactions and responses, and we'll hopefully draw some of those out in the discussion later on. Gatra, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mike, for the introduction. And at the outset, just want to thank China Matters for inviting me to speak on this webinar and to congratulate Yun for the publication of this impressive report. I think it's a very much, it's a decent contribution to this ongoing discussion that we're all having right now, both in Australia and Indonesia, about the future of the relationship in an age of great power rivalry. I mean, so it was sort of mentioned before, I think, in a way, Australia and Indonesia are somewhat responding to great power competition in different ways. There is the threat, as Evan likes to call it, of strategic divergence, where Australia sort of, through the AUKUS arrangement and many other initiatives, sort of doubled down on its preference for U.S. security leadership in the Indo-Pacific, whereas Indonesia has remained committed, I think, to ASEAN-centered regional multilateralism and ASEAN centrality. And I think in many ways, many people within the national security and policy community in Australia somewhat understand why Indonesia has responded to China in such a way. But I think there's much less appreciation for the complexity of Sino-Indonesian relations, which I think you've sort of managed to add to this discussion. Because I think, part of the reason why Indonesia and Australia sort of approach different pathways is because, firstly, Indonesia is just as cautious about the United States to an extent as it is about China. It's very suspicious of great power intentions generally. But also beyond that, I think Indonesians hold a very complicated view of China. Whenever you talk about the relationship between Indonesia and China, you always start off with the complexities of the Cold War. As you sort of mentioned, 23 years, the relationship was frozen because of concerns that China was a subversive threat to Indonesia. But I think at the same time, 30 years on, I don't know any bilateral relationship that Indonesia has that has undergone the same kind of transformation as China has. Having said that, simply because of China's size, China will still be seen within many circles in Indonesia as a challenge or a threat even. It maintains irredentist motivations in the South China Sea and many other places. It still has ambitions in Taiwan. And of course, that threatens Indonesia in a way that is somewhat unique compared to Australia, because you have, I think, up to 140,000 Indonesians living in Taiwan, many of them migrant workers. So there's the question of what do you do about protecting them and so on. And the economic dimensions is also very interesting. I think generally Indonesians are very cautious about foreign investment. And given that China's intentions are somewhat uncertain to many Indonesians, there's always the fear that China may sort of exploit its asymmetry with Indonesia and undermine Indonesia's security and sovereignty. And as Ben has sort of alluded to already, even though Indonesia has not been subjected to the kinds of course of economic practices that Australia has been subjected to, officials do watch these kinds of practices, and they're very cautious about it. They don't want it to happen to Indonesia. Now, all these fears about China are obviously balanced out by this perception of China as offering Indonesia with plenty of opportunities, especially to address many of the economic and social ills that the country is facing. Given its geography, interestingly, Indonesia doesn't really face that many traditional security challenges. The most pressing concerns are always going to be issues about governance, about, can we have the sufficient levels of infrastructure to sort of restore Indonesia's economic growth to 7%, like before the Asian financial crisis. And in a way, China offers solutions to a lot of these problems. And most likely in the long run, Indonesia and China will sort of deepen that relationship because of climate change. There's probably going to be much cheaper technologies, much more effective technologies that can help Indonesia sort of adapt to the effects, right? So, the relationship is quite complex. And both of these complexities sort of inform Indonesia's approach of trying to, I guess, exploit as much opportunities as it can from China's growing power, both economically and diplomatically, such as a counterbalance to the US, while at the same time, of course, looking for ways to minimize the risks. So that's why Indonesia's approach has always been focused on sort of dragging other powers into the region as well in a way, through, obviously, for dialogue, because the idea, I think, is you want to sort of contain their competitive impulses to within these institutions. I agree with one of your suggestions at the end that there is probably prudence for Australia and Indonesia to move forward by working on major governance issues, ranging from digital standards and climate change and so on. But of course, I think the biggest challenge is that great power competition is sort of spilling into domains beyond just the security realm. The tech domain is probably where we see competition deepening the most, right? So the initial step would be for Australia and Indonesia, I think, to sort of try to assert their middle power identities and really try to work together to prevent great power competition from ripping all these institutions apart. So I think I'll just stop there, and I look forward to discussion.
Forgot the mute thing. Thank you, Gatra, very much. Really fascinating comments. Over to you, Evan.
Thank you, Michael. Let me say thank you again to China Matters for having me. And let me congratulate Yun on a refreshing and insightful report. I really appreciate the chance to read it. I'll just make 3 quick comments based on the insight of the report and what I hope can be further thought for discussion. First, I think it was interesting for me reading in Yun's report about Beijing's optimism of its relationship with Indonesia. As you heard from both Ben as well as Gatra, Indonesia is not optimistic across the board. They are cautious. They are aware of the potential downfalls. They are aware of the history. They are aware of the sensitivities and the challenges that comes with a closer engagement. Now, that realization may not always translate to strategic coherence when it comes to responding, but they are, I would say, cautious at the worst, right? Which seems to be very different from how Beijing sees it. Whether it's deliberate downplaying of potential criticism of the relationship, but it's certainly in the narrative of Chinese analysts and policymakers that Yun highlights in the paper, there is a degree of optimism that's quite high in Beijing. And I think this is a pretty flawed assumption, I think, on the part of Beijing, because I do think that at the heart of it, Indonesia-China relations remain strategically fragile. It's still being put together by influential middle people, key policy figures that both sides can call on, but they're not based on a long-held diplomatic people-to-people economic ties and so forth and so on. So the relationship, as highlighted by Yun and others, is still very new over the last 2-3 decades. So I think there's a sense of false optimism there in Beijing. While I do agree that, I think Indonesia could be a key bellwether for Beijing to understand the region, I still think the relationship is actually much more fragile than Beijing would like to admit. And I think this goes to Yun's second point that I think is also kind of interesting, because in the dominant narrative, especially for those who come from the US-China competition space, Indonesia's economic sector is effectively bought off by the Chinese. That's kind of the simplistic narrative, when in fact, what I think is interesting about Yun's point is that the economic engagement with China is certainly amazing. It's certainly moving in terms of the right trends, but it is also a double-edged sword, that it actually highlights the fragility of the relationship, because it brings in the fear of economic hegemonic impulses in Indonesia. It brings the threat of potentially the influx of Chinese workers and so forth. And this, I think, is a common view shared by both the elites as well as the public. A survey that Ben mentioned earlier we did for Lowy 2 years ago. So I think it's interesting that China's calling card for its good relationship is actually a double-edged sword. But what's even more interesting is that the US does the same, except the area is defense and security relationship. It's unbelievably interesting for me that actually US and China are not that far different from one another as they make it like as they would like us to believe. But in fact, actually similar. The US also relies on its defense relationship, but in fact, defense relationship is also a double-edged sword with Indonesia. If you talk about human rights, if you talk about challenges in Papua and so forth. So in some sense, I think both sides rely on the one area that they felt they have an edge and try to hopefully either keep Indonesia in the middle so as not to go to the other side, but hopefully there's a strategic alignment somewhere down the line. Now, the last point that I would make, and I think Yun hit the nail on the head when she says that strategic alignment is exceptionally difficult for countries like Indonesia. And I would just like to add that I think the nature of strategic competition that's increasingly multi-domain, from technology, economic, security to education, I think it's certainly there to stay for now. It's not going to go away as much as we'd like it to go away. And so the challenge is then separating policy alignment at the sectoral level. If I do stuff with you on defense, that doesn't mean I will do stuff with you on the economic front, and vice versa. Understanding that sectoral alignments for countries like Indonesia is an important feature they want to keep, rather than one sector bleeding into the other, leading to a potential strategic alignment, cross-sectoral policy coordination, I think is a much harder sell. So I think as far as implications are concerned, I think Yun's insight is very useful for us to also be realistic in what to expect in relationships with Indonesia, whether you're Australia, China, or the US, in terms of the specific sectors that you're close with, and accept that there isn't going to be a broader strategic alignment in the pipeline. And to be honest, throughout Indonesia's history, there's probably one decade between 1966 to 1976 where there was such a strategic realignment across the board to the US. But after that, it went downhill again in terms of US-Indonesia relationship. So that's my three key takeaways, I think, from Yun's paper that I found very useful for us. The false optimism in Beijing, the fact that Beijing is actually like the United States, relying on one sector that's actually potentially a double-edged sword, and that for Indonesia, strategic realignment of any kind is not in the cards for now. Thank you, Michael.
Evan, thank you. And I think we've had a really rich set of comments on Yun's paper and her presentation. I'm going to ask Yun to, if she wants to respond to any of the panelists' observations and comments. But before I turn the floor over to Yun, can I encourage the audience, please do start thinking of your questions. We will come to your questions very shortly, and please do type them into the chat function of the webinar. But Yun, over to you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful comments. I wrote down a few keywords. I'm not sure if I'll be able to address every single point, but I will try my best. So I will actually first start with this optimism, because we did start talk a little bit before about optimism, and I agree that from what I've written, Beijing seems to be, the Chinese government seems to be a bit too optimistic about its future, including, I think I had a line in there about, it believes that whoever gets elected, it can work with. They can work with whoever gets elected. I guess one thing is that it depends on expectation as well. So when I say work with Indonesia, I guess the goal, we need to think about what they're expecting out of the relationship. And I feel that Beijing is not, the bar is not as high. So instead of striving for maybe a very close partnership or alliance, it appears to me that what the Chinese government wants simply is that for Indonesia not to be aligned, not to be too close to the United States. So if that was its goal, then perhaps it can be optimistic. And that's particularly because the point before about, Indonesia doesn't really trust any country. It doesn't trust China. It does, but it also doesn't trust the United States. So from China's perspective, if it doesn't trust the United States just as much as it doesn't trust China, then perhaps it's not too bad. So let me just, yes. Another, I love that point about implied sticks. So I guess that came into my mind because there's a recent talk about, we're looking back into the history, past 5 years, not long history, past 5 years of the Australia-China relationship, how that developed. And a lot of people has pat them on the back and said, well, clearly Australia has shown that China's coercion, economic coercion does not work. We still continue to trade with China. Coercion simply does not work. But I think that is a good point that, part of the audience for coercion is not the target country. It may not be Australia, but third countries, other countries. And I think then that's perhaps the narrative that also needs to bring out in Australia, that we can't just simply dismiss that coercion doesn't work. And it has an effect on other countries as well. And the point about war for diplomacy, certainly I totally agree. How China approaches, I think when this, from my personal perspective, when war for diplomacy all got started, and I was quite perplexed as well about, why is China being so confrontational against the world? But then I did slowly also realize that, it's not perhaps against the whole world, it's mainly targeted at certain countries, and that's mainly West countries. And its approach to the developing economies, developing countries, are often sometimes quite different. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind for us in Australia, that when we see how China approaches the West, is not how other countries see how China approaches them. I also find this comment really, I guess, it's quite interesting from a personal perspective. That a lot of countries, unlike the Western countries, like to have relationship that's based on trust. I think Ben made that point. But for a lot of other countries, they're a bit more transactional. And being I guess a Chinese Australian, I often hear this about how Asian countries, Asian cultures are less transactional than the West. But then you made this opposite point, and I think I need a bit more time to grapple with what that means exactly. So, so that's probably what I have so far. Interested to hear questions from other panelists still, and also from the audience.
Yun, thank you so much. I mean, there's rich material for discussion and debate there. And again, can I urge members of the audience to send their questions in. But let me ask a few of my own to Yun, but also to our panelists as well, who are specialists, particularly on Indonesian politics. And I think with the Indonesian national elections coming next year, and China playing somewhat of a prominent role in the last national elections in Indonesia, I think this is going to be an interesting set of questions. So let me begin by asking anyone who really wants to comment on the the current state of Indonesian attitudes towards the Chinese minority in Indonesia. It's a topic that Yun does cover in her paper, and of course we saw as recently as 1998 really quite deadly anti-Chinese riots in Indonesia. Anyone who would like to comment on the role of the Chinese minority in Indonesia and how that attitude of distrust towards the People's Republic of China may refract in Indonesian domestic politics against the Chinese minority. Who'd like to have a go at that one? Evan,
It's an interesting way. Sure. I was just saying it's interesting how it got silent when it's about ethnic Chinese Indonesian. But let me say a couple of things I think that could be relevant for further discussions. I think first, certainly the case of AIIA in 2017, I think set back ethnic Chinese Indonesian relationship with the broader society easily 10-20 years backwards rather than forward. I think that instilled enough of anxiety and fear among the ethnic Chinese Indonesians to ever want to try being active in the political sphere again. So for all of the controversies, the flaws and the plus and minuses of the case against AIIA, the point simply that case, I think, is still a warning, if you will, for many of those who want to do more in Indonesian politics and policy making, that ethnic Chinese Indonesians are still fragile in its position within wider Indonesian society, and no amount of public service, no amount of trying to give back and be part of the wider society will ever eliminate that insecurity for now. So I think that needs to be said. Second, I think it's also somewhat unique political confluence of things happening. Just so happens that Jokowi is an outsider, was an outsider when he was elected in 2014. Just so happens that PDIP's color of the party is red. And just so happens that a lot of the minorities also support a more nationalistic party like PDIP. And so, the way that the campaign unfolded in 2014 and 2019 certainly tried to conflate, being supported by PDIP means that you also secretly have some relationship with Beijing, but you're also supported by Indonesian ethnic Chinese business groups, and that you're also secretly pro-communism, and therefore you are anti-Islam. So that conflation of multitude of streams to criticize the campaign and the government after Jokowi won in 2014 and 2019, I think has made the issue of ethnic Chinese relationship even more sticky, I would say, because when there's a concern over, let's say, Chinese behavior in the North Natuna Sea, or there's a concern about Chinese Belt and Road project, political elites who like to use it to criticize the government or their opposition conflate those things between Beijing and ethnic Chinese Indonesians, and to some extent pro-communism and therefore anti-Islam. So it's as if we're seeing the return of the argument that Rizal Sukma used to call the triple threat argument about ethnic Chinese Indonesian in the 1960s and 70s. So my worry is that it is still alive. It's not alive because of some deep-seated societal resentment against ethnic Chinese Indonesians. I think it's alive because the political elites like to keep it alive and use it as a political tool to attack their opposition. So once again, I think it's mostly a largely a construct of the political elite rather than a deep-seated resentment in society.
Evan, thanks very much for that. I guess my next question is
sorry,
really...
I was just going to add that, while writing this, I have, this part is, I guess, one area that I have learned a lot because even though I grew up in China, I was not actually really aware of a lot of these anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia because as I did write in the report that they are intentionally downplayed in China for various reasons, for at least two reasons. One, I guess, is that the Chinese government wants to portray itself as its policies as quite effective. So if it was to publicize a lot of anti-China, anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia, that will show that perhaps then its foreign policy is not as effective as it claims. That maybe not everyone around the world loves BRI and Chinese investment. So that's one reason. And another reason, of course, is that it doesn't want to drum up nationalism. Like, for example, the Chinese government does drum up nationalism deliberately sometimes, for example, against Japan sometimes. But in these instances, it doesn't want to do that. But one thing that I have found is that, it has the government, the Chinese government has deliberately tried to not comment on any anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia. So through various elections, when these feelings have bubbled up, the government does try to stay away from that. Partly because it will only exacerbate the problem. The more it comments, the more it gets inflamed within Indonesia. So it doesn't really help, really. But despite its really careful, about commenting on these issues, the survey still does show that there is underlying sentiment of distrust towards the Chinese minorities, which does also mirror a little bit in the recent ACRI survey that shows that I think was also around 40% of Australians believe that Chinese Australians can be basically used by the Chinese government to for social cohesion, or to perhaps to do things that's not benefit Australia.
Thanks, Yun. I guess another question I have for you, but also for the panelists as well, is that your report doesn't really look at the role of ASEAN in the impact of ASEAN on China-Indonesia relations. I'm curious as to how Indonesia views the state of ASEAN at the moment. It's traditionally seen itself as a leader of ASEAN, and has generally couched its foreign policy within that regional framing. But I'm also curious about China's views on ASEAN. We know that it has difficulties in dealing with ASEAN and refuses to deal with ASEAN over the South China Sea. But I'm just curious as to how or whether ASEAN plays into China-Indonesia relations. Who'd like to take that one?
I'll just quickly comment that I didn't focus on ASEAN because I didn't want the report to be about China, ASEAN, but China, Indonesia, and there's so much you can write about ASEAN. But one thing is that one factor for Indonesia's importance to China is because of ASEAN. Indonesia is seen as a bellwether of ASEAN. And that's why China plays so much importance on Indonesia.
Thanks, Yun. Gatra, did you have a view on this? And then
Well,
Ben?
Sure, I'll just go very quickly. Well, thanks for that. So I think in many ways, ASEAN is seen as still the primary mechanism that's preferred to deal with regional security issues, including issues concerning the rise of China, such as the South China Sea disputes and even, East China Sea disputes as well. I think at one point, former Foreign Minister Martina Tagawa saw ASEAN playing a role there as well. And I think the preference again behind this is that there's a serious reluctance and concern and cautiousness about, recognition that there is that asymmetry between Indonesia and China. And using ASEAN as a platform to sort of engage with China on these kinds of issues would sort of empower it in a way. How do Indonesian officials see ASEAN? I think there's increasing variation. ASEAN centrality still remains very much the norm, I think, across the board. But there are pockets of individuals within the foreign policy think tank community that see ASEAN as needing some degree of reform. I think right now, say over the issue in Myanmar, right? I mean, there's evidence that Indonesia has ASEAN's power has its own serious limitations. And same goes for the South China Sea disputes. The code of conduct is just, in the process of perpetually being pushed away. I think early on in the beginning, the belief was that using ASEAN mechanisms as a way to engage China will provide it with the legitimacy that it requires, that it wants as a rising benevolent power. But there's probably growing unrest as well, and dissatisfaction about the limitations of what ASEAN can and can do.
Thanks, Gatra. To you, Ben.
Just to add, I think we often make the mistake of sort of seeing China in two sort of sui generis terms when, it's more interesting to me often to compare it to other outside powers trying to engage in Southeast Asia. And I think many Australians and many people in the UK and US also have this hope that they could not bother with ASEAN meetings and just, get Indonesia on side. Then Indonesia can get the rest of the ASEAN member states into line. But that ain't happening, unfortunately. I'm sure there is that hope, but I don't think Indonesia is a bellwether, to be honest, of ASEAN. And I think we've seen in the chairmanship year, Indonesia's ambitions, for ASEAN are actually quite muted. And that's a good thing, to be honest, for Indonesia's neighbors and the other member states, because they don't want to be pushed around by Indonesia. But I think there is no shortcut. So China is going to have to do what everyone else from the outside has to do, which is kind of the belt and braces, going to all the ASEAN meetings and then building the bilateral relationships. And if that ambition is to kind of find a shortcut, I think they're going to be mistaken. And also, if the aim is just to be able to put the brakes on ASEAN here or there, there are other member states who are closer to China who are probably more effective. I think ultimately you have to do everything. And it's not just about ASEAN, but the fact that Indonesia sits in the G20, Indonesia has kind of other global leadership ambitions, some of which I think will be fulfilled over the next decades. So clearly China understands, as other outside powers do, that it's not just about Indonesia and ASEAN, but Indonesia's role in these other global organizations. That's clearly a valuable country, if not to have on your side, at least as Yun puts it, to not be on the other side.
Thanks, Ben. Evan, any thoughts on this from you?
Just two quick points. I think first, it's certainly the case that now we are at a time when the level of ASEAN centrality for ASEAN member states themselves is significantly different from one another. I don't think we are at a time when they all value ASEAN equally. I don't think that's the case anymore. I was just in Manila last week, and for obvious reasons, that is expressed very strongly that their top 5 options to dealing with the latest incident has nothing to do with ASEAN mechanisms or even calling on Indonesia. So that, I think, tells you where we are right now. Second thing, and again, my view may be sort of clouded by more of the security side of things, but I would say that the assumption or the aspiration of ASEAN policymakers in the past that engaging China together through ASEAN and through the various ASEAN-led mechanisms like East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, and all of that will make China a much more, to use the old phrase, responsible stakeholder I think that hasn't really panned out as expected. In fact, I think in the case of the South China Sea, it's the reverse, that China has utilized the ASEAN Code of Conduct process to the detriment of Southeast Asian claimants. So I think China is a bit more pragmatic about what ASEAN can deliver to soften its image, to improve on economic ties. And, let's not make the ASEAN-China economic relationship as if China is giving us economic prosperity. We're also giving prosperity back to China. So it's an economic transaction. It's not a contribution of a one-way street nature. So for me, I think despite of all of these economic engagement, the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement that Yun also cited in the paper, I think from the bigger strategic picture, I think China has got more benefits from ASEAN than the other way around.
Thanks, Evan. Okay, we've got some audience questions coming in. Let me read out the first one, and then we'll go to our panelists and to Yun. The themes of trust and nationalism are obviously very important in this report. There is a gap between public distrust of China in Indonesia and the Indonesian government's positivity towards the PRC, and between the pragmatic approach of the PRC government towards Indonesia and nationalism and distrust of foreign powers amongst the Chinese public. My question is that gap sustainable, and how does it affect foreign policy? That's from Kiara Morris, a PhD candidate at the City University of Hong Kong. Who'd like to have a go at that? I think it's a great question.
Excellent question. I do think about nationalism a lot as well. I have previously written a few reports and articles on nationalism in China, so I'll focus maybe a little bit on the China angle. Yes, the government does try to tinker with nationalism. It's sometimes deliberately trying to inflame or drum up nationalist feelings in China through sometimes through quite overt means, such as talking about racial attacks towards Chinese people. Sometimes a little bit more subtle, such as showing those war resistance against Japan war films. That's usually targeted at Japan. So nationalism is usually in China targeted at countries such as Japan and the United States. They are perceived to have done China wrong, and I think for a lot of people in China, they do harbor a lot of them do harbor some resentment towards these countries. But on the other hand, the government also try to temper it sometimes as well. So it doesn't always try to jump it up. It also does the opposite. So for example, recent example I can think of include when there's a online nationalism is always very, 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 very online. Online nationalism, I think, is a problem in a lot of countries, not just China. But when there are nationalists online, that was very basically beating the drum of war against the United States when some of their US politicians visit Taiwan, for example, the Chinese government would often sometimes publicly appeal to the people, Chinese people, to be more rational about their nationalism. So it's not always increasing nationalism. Sometimes it goes trying to decrease nationalism. And in case of towards Indonesia, I think that's not really a problem, because there is not really this resentment towards Indonesia among the population like they do harbor against, say, United States and Japan. And certainly the government has not tried to develop that and to make the population want to take any forms of national sentiment or any actions against Indonesia.
Thanks, Yun. I've got a question here from Mike Ahrens. What is the situation in Indonesia with Belt and Road projects? Who'd like to have a go at that? Ben?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I mean, I think the Lowy Institute recently published some really good data on development finance in Southeast Asia, and you can see that China's been a really important player in the whole region, particularly in Indonesia. And obviously, one of the most high-profile projects is the high-speed rail between Jakarta and Bandung, which should be coming online this year. So that's gone well. I think one thing that a lot of people in Indonesia and the rest of South Asia and the rest of the world don't really see or aren't thinking about is how China is sort of changing when it comes to its sort of outbound investment plans. And I think at the elite level, the BRI is being explicitly de-emphasized, partly because of the economic challenges in China, partly because of the digestion problem of so many big infrastructure projects in difficult markets. I mean, Chinese investors struggle in Indonesia, just like a lot of other foreign investors, or in Laos and other places. So I think actually what we're going to see is that the pace of outbound investment into infrastructure and the power sector probably won't match what we saw over the years pre-COVID in the next 5 or 10 years. But I don't really think anyone in many people in Indonesia or the rest of South Asia or the rest of the world are really thinking about that. Especially a lot of developing countries are still banking on sort of Chinese investment answering a lot of their development problems. But I'm simply not sure that that's going to be the case because of changes in China, which probably kind of leads me to think all of us probably need to have better connected conversations about China. I think it's interesting if we can connect more Southeast Asian China watchers to China watchers in the rest of the world to kind of share views, because we all have different perspectives. We could probably learn quite a lot from each other, because when you are far away, you can see sometimes things with more clarity, but you also obviously miss a lot too.
Thanks, Ben. We're right up against time, but I think there's time for one more question. Can you speak more of how you see Chinese overseas diplomacy in Indonesia? And that's from Christine Susanna Tin. So China's Chinese overseas diplomacy. Maybe that's one for you, Yun?
Sorry, I don't quite get the question. I think diplomacy towards overseas Chinese, what Chinese government calls overseas Chinese?
Yeah.
Okay. So, recently, not recently, I guess it's been more than 10 years since she came into power. So she has been emphasizing a lot about harnessing the power of the Chinese diaspora in building up the country, building up China, the country, and using them to becoming more powerful, or at least to the benefit of the country, not necessarily becoming more powerful. Excuse me. That's not that's not unusual. A lot of countries do have these kind of diasporic policies. India does the same. It also wants its overseas Indian population to contribute to the home country, and it's a very common call from developing country governments. However, that has also caused some concerns because of in Australia, especially with foreign interference concerns, when it does activities trying to influence the local Chinese communities in Australia through what the Chinese Communist Party often calls the United Front activities. Now, some of its influence activities are legitimate. They are done by a lot of governments around the world, while others are maybe a little bit more hidden, more covert, and sometimes they're even coercive, and that can cause problems in countries such as Australia. In terms of Indonesia in particular, I am not too certain what the Chinese government has really been doing to try to appeal to the Chinese Indonesian population. And that's because I think, unlike Australia, where there are lots of new recent migrants that still, such as international students, that still have a lot of very strong connections to China, the mainland China. Indonesia's pattern of migration is a bit more different. And indeed, what we've seen in the past with a lot of those racially motivated riots, the Chinese embassy has often not have done that much to help the Chinese Indonesians. They said to a lot of them that, a lot of times, that that you are Indonesian, you're not Chinese, because that's your citizenship. So they haven't really been actually actively helping the population there, and that's kind of a quite different narrative to what we've been presented to in Australia sometimes, when we often think of Chinese government as trying to actively, helping the local Chinese communities, whereas in a lot of cases in Indonesia, they've deliberately tried to avoid doing that.
Okay, thanks, Yun. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much to Ms. Yun Jiang for introducing her new research report, and to our expert panelists, Mr. Ben Bland, Dr. Gatra Priyandita, and Dr. Evan Laksmana for joining us in the discussion. Thank you also to the AIIA and to China Matters staff for organising this webinar, and importantly, to the founding donors and supporters who have made the fellowship program possible. If you would like to read Yun's report in full, or any of her other work, please head to the China Matters website. Thank you to our audience today for listening in and submitting your questions, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next event. For now, good night.